Hello, everyone. We'll wait a few moments as you all join in. Thank you for being here. So let's begin. Welcome, everyone. We're thrilled to have you join us for this conversation on the intersection of AI and history, a long-awaited discussion, and an area that is rapidly evolving and raising fascinating questions about how we remember, interpret, and engage with the past. Today, we have two incredible panelists who bring unique perspectives and expertise to this discussion. Jason Steinhauer is a historian, author, and an expert in the ways technology shapes public understanding of history. His work explores how AI and digital media influence historical narratives, academic research, and public discourse. Thank you for being here, Jason. And we have Nathan Lockenmeyer. He's a creative technologist and entrepreneur specializing in immersive storytelling. Through his company Sitara Systems, he designs cutting-edge experiences that bring history to life in interactive and engaging ways. His work bridges the gap between technology, education, and cultural heritage. Thank you so much for your time, Nathan.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So together, we'll all help unpack the opportunities, challenges, and ethical implications of AI's role in shaping history. So let's dive in. So we wanted to kind of phase this conversation in and like categorize into three phases. So the first half of the discussion will be setting up the context and understanding the role of AI in history, what it even means, because a lot of us come from different areas of life and domains, and history might mean something different for all of us. And in the next phase, we want to look at the challenges. What are the growing trends in history and AI and the intersection? And eventually discuss the pitfalls and what are the future directions. So, starting off with the first question for you both to set the stage for discussion. To begin, could you both explain what AI in history means to you specifically? For many of us students, coming from a student perspective, history revolves around major events for us, like the Civil War, the Cold War. From your perspective, from your respective fields, what does history mean to you? And what do you believe? And why do you believe is your voice so relevant in today's conversation? So let's start with Nathan.
All right. Well, that's a really great place to start the conversation. I think that the first and most important thing for me of thinking about history and AI or history and any kind of technology is really highlighting that history is a process and not just historical facts. And that I think a lot of people maybe don't think about or consider that history is like science, an active investigation field. And there's ongoing research, there's ongoing revision and reassessment and conversations about what history means, and it's a living thing that's being reinterpreted. Um, and I think that makes it, in my mind, more clear how technology can kind of interplay with that. From my perspective, my background's in human computer interaction, which is kind of this formal academic field of how people use technology as a tool, but then also how the tool shapes us in return. Like, what is it about the tool that changes people in the process of using it? So when I think of history and I think of two kind of primary areas. I think of how historians, as a professional practice, use AI as a tool, right? Like, what are the possibilities of how artificial intelligence or this kind of broad category of intelligent tools can help historians with that investigative work that they do. How can it make them faster and more effective researchers? How can it assist them with their jobs? And how can they use it in ways that helps them make insights that maybe they wouldn't have made otherwise? And the other place that I think about is artificial intelligence in the public communication of history. So I think about how can we use technology more broadly, AI in particular, to tell better stories of how history is made, of what are the narratives that we think are true at the moment, but also how do we communicate and uncover the uncertainties in history, the process in history? How do we communicate to the public that these aren't answers that we found in a book and we're telling you, but like historians have debated these things, they've researched these things, and that this is an ongoing story and it's subject to change, and that this is the best idea that we have of what happened and the best sense of what we have for history, but it's an ongoing process. So from my perspective, those are the kinds of the two things that I'm the most interested in when I think of AI and history.
Awesome, thank you. And Jason, since you're the founder of History Communications Institute, we're intrigued to hear your perspective as well.
Well, first of all, it's nice to see everyone here. Thanks for joining. And special kudos and congratulations to Ishita for pulling together this remarkable series of panels. When I was Ishita's age, I was probably most concerned about where I was going out on a Friday night and what I was wearing. I was not in any way, shape, or form precocious enough to pull together sophisticated intellectual discussions the way you have. So congratulations to you. Um, assuming that many people on this call are not in the field of professional history, it may be a surprise to folks to realize that there's a lot of debate about what actually being a professional historian means and what history actually is. You mentioned that for some people, there's this perception that history is only these large seismic events, civil wars, World War II, important people like presidents of the United States, for example. And that is one perception or one aspect of historical study. But there's a whole entire field that sort of thinks about history as not as the large seismic events, but the space between those events. And so that's called the history of everyday life. And that's a huge field and a huge preoccupation within the history profession. And that's where you get things like social history and cultural history. Why is that important? Because oftentimes big seismic events only involve small select groups of people. And so having that perspective opens up history to much more diverse categorizations of people, to include people who otherwise may be written out of history or may not be included. Um, when you think about the 19th century, for example, when you think about something like the US Civil War, if we were to only focus on what happened on the battlefield, we would miss the influence and the role of women, for example, who weren't serving on the battlefield. We would miss the influence of families and children and how that was affected during the Civil War before and after the antebellum period. So all that becomes more incorporated into the corpus and into the historical arguments that we make when we expand the picture beyond just large seismic events. Now, the other aspect of this is there's a definition of history that I really like, which is from a man named John Arnold, who's a historian who writes in the UK. And he says that history is an argument. And I really like this definition. Why? Because none of us was at the American Revolution. None of us knows what happened there. We didn't live through it. So what we do is we make arguments about what happened at the American Revolution based on the available evidence that we have. Some of that evidence comes from soldiers who served on the front lines, either in the colonies or the United Kingdom, or from French or from Germans who were involved in the American Revolution. Some of it comes from people in communities, enslaved persons, free persons, women, indigenous populations. All of these evidences are then used to make arguments about why the revolution or war for independence happened and why it was important. Again, because none of us was there. Okay. So if we think about history as an argument, if we think about history as large seismic events, if we think about history as a space between those large seismic events, then that becomes a much more expansive view on what history entails and what professional historians do. And it creates lots of different avenues wherein technology can become involved. And I'll end by quickly illuminating some of those, which we can then get into in our subsequent discussion. If we think about, we have to make arguments based on evidence. Okay, so where does that evidence come from? Well, in the past, it came from documents and from letters and from photographs and from journals, from magazines and newspapers. Increasingly today, that evidence comes from social media, comes from places like TikTok and Instagram and emails and all kinds of electronic communications that we create on a regular basis. And it's now going to include evidence that is coming from AI generated materials. So how does the inclusion of AI generated materials into that body of historical evidence change the types of arguments that we make? Then, as Nathan pointed out, just in terms of how we make arguments, in the past, we didn't have the ability to synthesize and crunch huge amounts of data in the way that we do now because of artificial intelligence applications and large language models, et cetera. So AI applications can also just change the way we make our arguments. They can change the way we crunch data. They can change the amount of data that we take into consideration, and they might help us find new patterns in the data that we didn't know were there. And the last part about it that I'll just briefly touch on here before moving to the next part of the conversation is what happens when it's not humans making the arguments, but machines, right? What happens if we outsource those historical arguments and that analysis of historical data to machines entirely? So basically, we tell large language models to write the histories. We tell AI agents or chatbots to teach the history courses. How does that change the types of histories that we do? What types of narratives will it leave out? What types of narratives will it include? I think all those questions are on the table for us to discuss.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing two different lenses of viewing history, both with the same purpose of ensuring our past is carefully curated for the future to be paved well. So, diving into more of the exciting and somewhat controversial topics of this discussion that I was really looking forward to specifically, and a lot of students are, experiencing in their day-to-day lives, what's been buzzing currently in the digital history world. So, Nathan, I wanted to talk about there's multiple things that we hear these days. Like the TikTok trends, AI generated videos, and the historical videos that bring to life. One such example that is in like real life is something museums are doing, which is like recently there was the University of Southern California's Dimensions and Testimony project, which basically allows visitors to engage with AI generated conversations of Holocaust survivors. These immersive experiences are transformed in how we interact with history in this world. And it raises some questions about like authenticity and the emotional depth of these conversations. So, what are your thoughts on projects like these? And then we'll come back to, the social media world from like the physical.
Hmm. That's a great source of conversation. It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, actually. So I guess I'll just start with a summary of what this project is for people who aren't familiar with it. But Dimensions in Testimony is this project that's kind of rooted in the goal to preserve the eyewitness testimony of people who experienced the Holocaust. So, that generation in the 1940s, they're getting old, they're slowly passing away, there's fewer and fewer people who actually saw it with their own eyes. So there's a lot of pressure to kind of collect all of these primary sources and preserve them for future generations to learn about it. And one of the primary ways that Holocaust education is done is through these eyewitness testimonies, is having someone who saw with their own eyes come and talk to audiences and visitors at museums and telling them, this isn't just something that you're reading in a book, but like I saw it myself with my own two eyes. Dimensions and Testimony is an interesting project because it's trying to use technology to kind of extend that eyewitness account. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about how it actually works in the first place, which might explain some of the controversy around the project. The The project is actually done with traditional interviews. So they do, I think it's like 6 to 8 hours of interviews with eyewitnesses in a very traditional question and answer format. And then they chop up every question and answer into a short clip. And then they provide transcripts, they provide annotation, they manually label this conversation, every question, every answer pair. And then when you go to the museum, you have the opportunity to sit in a theater, hear this person speak, and then you can stand up and you can ask questions to this kind of digital survivor, digital eyewitness, and hear what they have to say. And the only AI component to this entire project is that it listens to what question you've asked, and then it tries to identify what the best answer from their kind of 8 hour collection of answers is to answer the question that you've asked. So I think it's really important to note that all the answers are verbatim answers from eyewitnesses. None of their answers are being altered or generated by AI. Everything's being said in their own words. Everything is pre-recorded. So in terms of a lot of concerns about AI answers, nothing's being generated, which does alleviate a lot of the concerns. I think what I get the most concerned about personally is that there's a lack of transparency and authenticity on the part of the people presenting this to the audiences. That there's always a lot of kind of buzzword terminology in institutions about holograms and AI and using the latest and greatest technology to kind of attract people to it and engage them. And I think that makes people wary of what they're about to see, especially because museums come from a position of intellectual authority and authenticity, and people expect everything from these institutions to be true and factual and carefully thought out and responsibly done. So I think that, in a sense, inflating the technology and saying that it's AI when people don't really understand what AI is might actually make people less likely to believe what they say than if they actually knew how it worked, which is that you're just listening to questions and answers from an eyewitness. Like there's nothing being generated. We're just picking the best answer for you to hear, which is a job that a person could do, but an AI can do that much faster and in real time rather than, asking, hey Jason, can you find the best answer for this question that someone has, and then you search through the archives and it takes you an hour to go find the best clip from the archive that you'd like to share. Um, I think the last part that I have to say just about these kind of tools in general, about kind of addressing the elephant in the room of generative artificial intelligence and generating videos or generating scripts, is again, I think the danger isn't in the technology, but the risk is in the public understanding and the transparency around what the goals of the work are and how it's being produced. I think that in the current media landscape, or in an older media landscape, like we understood the purpose of different forms of media. Like no one was upset that the movie Gladiator wasn't historically accurate. No one gets upset when video games aren't accurate. If you play Assassin's Creed and you say, well, this isn't really how the Crusades went. It's like, well, we understand that it's a game. There's an expectation and a social expectation that we're participating in a story and it's fictitious, and that maybe it'll get us interested in some aspect of history, but we shouldn't take it literally. And I think that one of the things, and I'm sure Jason can speak much more eloquently about this, as this is kind of his expertise, is that the current media landscape is getting so much more conflated with entertainment and facts and education all being kind of put into a blender together, where we don't have necessarily the public understanding or public literacy around what's going on with the media that we're consuming. And is it meant to be factual? Is it meant to be entertainment? Like we kind of consume all of that from the same entertainment channels. And to me, the kind of biggest thing is that there needs to be greater investment in public literacy around artificial intelligence and the kinds of content that are generated from it, so that we can look at content and say, okay, this is AI generated. Like I'm looking at the context of it. This is meant to be entertainment. Like I shouldn't take everything 100% seriously here. And I think that's something that we're really kind of lacking in this space of how technology is being used in public communication.
Yeah, awesome. I think one thing I would like to say is like Explainability is one of the key cornerstones of AI ethics, and I think this, what you just mentioned, really like hones in on that point. And also creating these smart systems, it's not a flex for them to be complex, but it's a flex to make them clear. There's more
Hmm.
clarity. So, thank you for sharing that. Now, moving to the social media side of the world, Jason, AI generated videos on TikTok, Instagram these days, where users can wake up to historical events like ancient Rome or the Titanic, are gaining a lot of popularity. Historians, however, have noted several errors in these videos, including you. And should we be concerned about the accuracy of these videos? And or is there any value being sparked through this? Like, is there value in sparking interest enough to overlook the mistakes? Like, is there value that we can be like, oh, it's fine because obviously it's not going to be accurate, but what's that balance?
So first off, just to Nathan's point that he made, there are plenty of historians who are upset about the lack of accuracy in historical video games, particularly as it relates to World War II. I used to serve on the board of the World War II Museum in New Orleans, and I've been in many conversations with World War II historians who were very upset about the lack of accuracy in historical video games. Also very upset about the fact that their students seem to know every single weapon that the Nazis carried, but couldn't tell you, anything else about the war, right? Because they learned all that from video games. Also, there's a whole world of historians who critique movies for lack of historical accuracy. You can find them on Twitter, or used to be able to find them on Twitter. They're not probably on Blue Sky, but they used to watch movies every single week and then just point out all the inaccuracies in the movies. And so now we're on to social media, where you have historians also pointing out how inaccurate history is on social media. By the way, when Wikipedia came out in the early 2000s, probably before some of you were born, historians were criticizing Wikipedia for its lack of accuracy. So historians criticizing various media for their lack of historical accuracy is in itself a tried and true historical truism of the history profession. Right. The alternate media to that is produced not by professional historians is always deemed inferior to the history produced by professional historians. It's one of the ways that professional historians continue to argue or try to argue for their relevancy. Because if every single movie or every single TikTok video was as good as what professional historians made, then why would you need professional historians? Right? It's the same way that journalists argue that professional journalism is better than citizen journalism. And it's the same way that professional artists argue that their art is more valuable or more interesting or more important than AI generated art, right? So all of these professions have a vested interest in building a moat around themselves and saying that the stuff that happens outside that moat is not as high quality as what happens inside the moat. Now, does that actually matter in the grand scheme of things? I think is actually the essence of your question. In I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that actually users don't particularly care about the level of accuracy of information that they find on social media. This is true of journalism, it's true of politics, and it's true of history. Over the past 15 to 20 years, if people really cared about the level of accuracy on social media, they probably would have stopped using social media. But they haven't, right? Social media's use has only grown and grown and grown, and expanded, expanded, expanded. So why is that the case? Well, one of the things arguments I make in my book is that actually when it comes to the incentive structures built into social media, accuracy is very, very low down on the list. What matters on social media is attention. And if you can grab attention and accumulate attention and grow your followers and monetize your content, whether it's accurate or inaccurate doesn't really matter. What matters is how best you leverage the platform in order to achieve those goals. So people who are creating history content on TikTok, maybe they strive for accuracy, maybe they don't. Maybe they use AI, maybe they don't. But ultimately, the incentives within the TikTok ecosystem are for visibility, right? The more visible you get your content, the more eyeballs it reaches, the more virality it achieves, the more you can grow your follower account, and the more you can then potentially monetize that follower account either directly on TikTok or off it as a speaker or a presenter or whatever, right? That's the way the incentive is, that's the way the system is set up. And so history becomes embedded, as Nathan was saying earlier, in this churn of content that we see every day on our phones. And you might see beauty content, or you might see journalism content, or you might see political content, or you might see travel content, and then you might see history content. And the real benefit is for the creator, because if the creator can make his or her content go viral, then he or she has a chance to accumulate influence. And once you accumulate influence, then you can demand more money in the marketplace. So that's the way social media works. History profession works very differently. History profession, oftentimes we write articles that are read by only one or two people. And so visibility is not always a determining factor into how valuable something is inside the world of professional history. So one of the questions that we've been asking at the History Communication Institute is, how do you bridge these two ecosystems that have very different value structures and incentives built into them, right? The incentive for accuracy oftentimes works against the incentive for visibility. I'll say that again one more time, right? The incentive to make accurate information, whether historical information or journalistic information, oftentimes is working against the incentive for high visibility. Because the more outrageous you can make something, the more surprise, shock, and oh my goodness type of quality you can give to something, then the more chance it stands at being visible. So accuracy and visibility on social media oftentimes are counteracting forces. So how do you bridge that gap? And I think how you bridge that gap is through this question of ethics, right? And through the type of work that we've been doing at the History Communication Institute, which tries to think about how you marry this world of professional history that strives for accuracy and arguments based on evidence with this world of social media that strives for hyperbole and exaggeration and surprise and just getting content in front of as many eyeballs as possible.
Wow, you summarized the gist and the essence of the History Communications Institute really well. And, it's clearly visible that it's not just for historians, but we're all responsible for how the content is, received. Not just, the one-way side to it, but it's a two-way communication and how we perceive the content. Do we internally know this? I personally didn't know that there's this like counteracting force of like accuracy versus, how emotionally provocative something is that it, tends to make it more visible. But yeah, amazing conversation. Now moving on to understanding more of the role AI plays in shaping historical narratives, it is important to consider the impact on public understanding and also, as you mentioned, ethical challenges. So, Nathan, since you're experienced in the museum space, so as museums, as we just discussed with one of the projects, as museums adopt AI to enhance visitor experiences, how can they balance with innovation? Um, how can they balance innovation and the historical accuracy we just spoke about? And how do you address these kind of challenges at Sitara Systems?
Yeah, I mean that's the biggest challenge right there. I think, like Jason said, just there's one of the biggest challenges with every institution out there is that attention is kind of the biggest currency right now, and that the incentives are not aligned for doing good work for the most part. That doing work that is accurate and true and factual is oftentimes at odd with innovation, with attention, and with funding for your work. Um, I think in terms of how we approach our work, I've kind of alluded to a little bit of how we've in my previous answers. We think of artificial intelligence as a tool that is used by creators. It's not a solution looking for a problem. Like, we don't start out our work saying we want to use artificial intelligence to tell this story. We start with humans, a combination of technologists, of designers, of historians, of content experts getting together and saying, what is the story that we want to tell? What is the narrative? What is the purpose of this? Are we looking for factual education of visitors in a museum, or is this a piece or a moment where we're looking for emotional engagement? And we do want to it's okay if we're a little bit faster and looser with facts because we want people to have an emotional reaction to the piece that we're having. So that's one thing that we think about. And then the other part is for us to always have transparency with visitors about if we are having things generated by AI, and I say specifically generated, like if a human didn't write the copy or a human didn't make these images, then I think from an ethical and from a public education and just from an authenticity perspective, we have an obligation to be transparent about the fact that you're looking at images that humans didn't make, that AI generated. You're reading copy that an AI generated. Um, in the work that we do, we never release anything unless a human reviews it and edits it, and we hold kind of artificially generated content to the same editorial and content standards that any other content would be. But I think even with that safeguard, for the public's insights and education, it's important to still be transparent with them about, how we're using these tools and how these tools are shaping the world that they're seeing. Um,
Could you
I
also
think that
share a bit about, could you also share a bit about Sitara Systems for our viewers? As a company, kind of how did it come about and like what was its goal initially? And
so Sitara Systems is thinking of an audience who doesn't know that much about museums, perhaps, and maybe has more of an experience and interest in history. Um, Sitara Systems is a firm that uses technology to tell stories in museums. So we look at exhibits in museums, at public-facing um, engagements, and usually we work with subject matter experts who say, we want to tell a story, we want to tell a narrative, we want our audience to understand this topic better. And oftentimes the best way to do that isn't with printed words and static graphics, it's using technology and the affordances that we have with technology to create interactive experiences, to create motion graphics, to kind of take advantage of all the different ways that we can consume media. So our firm works in ideating and thinking about how do you use media as a tool for public education in a way that furthers the goals of the institution, which primarily for museums is an educational goal, and it's a goal to get people to learn facts and oftentimes to take action. So those are kind of what we're always thinking about as we're designing our experiences. Were there other parts of the question that I didn't answer? I feel like there was a couple different
yeah,
parts.
sorry to cut you off in the middle, but I think you were talking about the challenges and what steps you take in that process. So being authentic about generative AI content and how it was created. If there was a raw script involved, you also include that. That's what we left off at.
Yeah, I think maybe going off on a little bit of a tangent, but when thinking about artificial intelligence, an idea I like to introduce people to, and Jason knows this, he's heard me speak about this before, is the idea of what we call in the technical field the centaur, right? Like a centaur is a half human, half horse. For doing knowledge work, for doing this kind of specialized work, in a technical sense, a centaur is half human, half AI, is a pairing of the two working together to create content or create an outcome that's more effective than either one of them could be individually. And I kind of alluded to this in the previous, when I was talking about dimensions and testimony, that fundamentally what they're doing is something that a human could do. If I asked a question, I could ask someone to go through an 8-hour interview and find the best part of the interview that answers the question. A human could do that and they could do that well, but they can't do it fast enough to be effective. So instead, we use an artificial intelligence which is able to search transcripts and search work and do it much, much faster. We see this all around us. An example I often use is Uber is an example on your phone. That, being able to match a driver and a caller in real time in the 60 seconds that it does it is something that a human would never be able to do at the volume of millions and millions and millions of users. Computers are really great at that. Computers aren't great at driving yet. They're really terrible at it. So we have humans do the hard part, which is driving, the part that's hard for computers, and we have computers do the part that's difficult for humans, which is being able to look through all of this data and make the best pairing and the best matching for them. So that's a model that we're always looking for, is not how do we use AI as a standalone tool, like how do we get these kind of smart tools to do the work for us, but it's how do we have these tools make human authors and human subject matter experts more effective and faster at the work that they're doing so that they can do more work and more meaningful work.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much for that. And now, you mentioned, large language models and like the increasing capabilities of like speech and transcription. Coming to the rise of large language models in generating this level of historical content, Jason, how do you see this technology influencing the way history is understood by public versus how it's presented in academic scholarship? Additionally, what are the concerns, ethical concerns we should be aware of that even the History Communications Institute has had, multiple engagements in saying.
Yeah, it's a big question. It's one that I think many disciplines are still trying to sort out, including professional history. I mentioned before that historians oftentimes see history as an argument. It's an argument that we make based on evidence, right? Part of the training that one gets in becoming a professional historian, or even if you don't want to become a professional historian, just taking a history class in high school or college, is you learn how to make good arguments. You learn how to take evidence, to evaluate evidence, to realize that you oftentimes need multiple pieces of evidence in order to figure out what where may or may not have happened in a particular situation. You learn how to read against the grain of evidence. And what I mean by that is that oftentimes if someone writes a letter that you want to use to make, to write about history, you have to realize that there's stuff in the letter, but there's stuff that people left out of the letter. So what did they leave out? And why did they leave it out? And that's part of reading against the grain of evidence, right? So all that is what you do when you're working historically, when you want to think historically or think critically. Okay, so what happens if we outsource all of that to a machine? What happens if we just let large language models evaluate all the evidence for us? If we allow large language models to come up with the arguments for us? What does that do to the professional discipline of history? If history is about teaching people how to make arguments, but then we've decided that we're no longer going to force people or challenge people to do that, we're just going to allow them to outsource it to machines, then are they really doing history anymore, or are they doing something else? And so I think that's a real existential question that is facing the profession right now, both in the workplace and also in schools. And I'll share another article that was recently written about whether we are in the last generation of historians, and that might seem like a little bit of exaggeration, but again, if the job of the historian is to make arguments, and we then outsource the making of arguments to machines, then what role do historians still have? And so I think this is sort of one of these questions again where it comes down to an ethical considerations that we as a society writ large have to make, but also then have to get made in very local contexts, right? So we may believe that it's unethical for us to prevent students from working with large language models because they're out there, they're going to be needed in the workplace, and it's important to have that skill in order to attain future employment. But it may also be unethical for students to use large language models in particular situations. One of those situations might be inside of a history class. If you're asked to write a history essay, maybe it's not ethical to use the large language model to evaluate the evidence and generate the argument for you. Maybe you have to do that yourself. Because maybe the process of doing that actually gives you some skills and works parts of your brain that you're going to need just as a citizen and as a future employee. And so I think figuring out those boundaries of where LLMs can be useful and where it's incumbent upon educators to include them in the curriculum versus when they actually get in the way of students developing critical faculties that they're going to need later in life, and when we should insist that they not use large language models. I think that's an area that is still very, very fuzzy and is still being navigated and negotiated in a lot of different contexts in a lot of different ways. And just as one last thing, OpenAI just put out a report in January of 2025 looking at LLM usage among 18 to 24-year-olds. And so it turns out the highest usage of LLMs among that age group is for education purposes, oftentimes to help them write essays. Again, for a student perspective, this is great. It helps me write my essay. It's a shortcut to completing the assignment. It helps me get a better grade. From an instructor perspective, it's like there's a question there, which is that if students are outsourcing this creative generative work, this evidence evaluation work to a large language model, are they actually learning anything? Right? Are they actually exercising the critical faculties and muscles in their brains that we think that they need? The other thing that OpenAI found in this report was that students are not waiting for their professors to figure this out, right? So students are not sitting around being like, well, my professor hasn't told me yet how I can or cannot use this. So no, they don't wait. They just go ahead and they use it, right? So we as educators need to catch up to where the students are, and we need to figure out what these boundaries are quickly.
Wow, that was profound. And it actually reminded me of like one of the essays, Paul Graham, the founder of the Y Combinator. Um, so here's the link to that. It's called Write and Write Knots, and it's very similar to the point that you were trying to make. Something that he mentions in the essay is that after a point in the future, the people who stop writing will lose the ability to think. Because to think, you need to write it and articulate it. And if we're just supplementing everything to large language models, like for our essays, for the key skills that we learn and develop while writing those essays, making those claims, making those counter arguments, we're gonna miss that key critical thinking skill. And I think you both make really good points about how this is an essential skill for the 21st century to develop, especially when evaluating large language models and their outputs. So awesome discussion here. Now looking to the future. How can historians and AI developers kind of collaborate to ensure that AI tools in historical research and digital storytelling are aligned? We discussed the misalignment of these incentives from visibility being misaligned with accuracy. Now, how can we come together, the fields of history and the fields of AI, students in both? How can we come together? How can we collaborate? And how can we sort of establish standards to work off? So I think starting with Nathan, I would love to hear your perspective since you got your degrees in engineering and physics at MIT, and then you moved into this, non-traditional field for, engineering application, starting your own firm, in history and AI intersection. So interesting to hear your views here, and as well, Jason, since you've been on the Department of State and you've had multiple engagements. So let's start with Nathan.
Looking at the future, I think there's a couple of different points to be made. Um, one of them is, I think, as Jason mentioned earlier, like historians love building a moat around them, around what is expertise and what is not expertise. And at least in my experience, and this has happened in every field, historians are not alone in this, but a lot of subject matter experts have um, kind of turned away from using AI because they feel like it doesn't work to the level of the standards that they would like it to be. They feel like it's a threat to the work that they do and that it is having negative repercussions in the field. Like Jason said, students are using it and not learning. It's flooding the internet with things that aren't true. And I've seen a lot of subject matter experts in every field kind of turn away from AI or want to pretend that it's not there because they feel like it's not providing positive value. And I think that is a path that will lead to professional irrelevance. science for any subject matter expert, not embracing AI. In a sense, we've opened up Pandora's box and it's here and it is a part of the toolkit and the technology out there. And it's something that everyone will need to learn to engage with in a meaningful way. Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, which is the largest provider of AI hardware in the world, right? I think he said it best when he said, you won't lose your job to AI, but you'll lose your job to someone who uses AI effectively to help them. And I think that's a huge takeaway for subject matter experts in any field, but specifically history, that you can't turn away from it. It's something that we'll have to learn to integrate and work, to integrate into the way that we work and create work. I think history, because there's a lot of properties of history that we've talked about that I think make it a good partner for people that are software developers and creating artificial intelligence tools. I think that historians are critical thinkers. They're used to evaluating evidence. They're used to questioning things. They're used to, as Jason said, looking at what was left out, right? And I think those are extremely powerful and useful thinking skills to have when working with AI tools and with helping developers make more effective AI tools, with kind of poking at the open AIs of the world and helping them think through, like, well, what are they leaving out of their models? What tools have they not created? For example, like, we can generate so much content with artificial intelligence, but we don't have very many tools that are effective at helping us identify what content has been created with artificial intelligence. And that's a huge area where, if we're talking about public literacy and aligning incentives, being able to identify what text was generated by AI or what images were generated by AI is enormously helpful for the public and for teachers and for people outside of the AI field, for being able to use it more effectively and control and incentivize its use in proper ways. I think historians are also very well equipped to help the technology industry think through, how is this technology going to be adopted? I mean, we've seen technology adopted in so many ways, and the only thing that's different right now is that it's happening faster than it has before. It's the scale and speed at which AI has spread to widespread adoption has just been mind-bending, and it's so much faster than people can respond to it to come up with these kinds of policies. But I think historians are in a good place to be able to look at the past and say, okay, well, here's how these tools were typically used when new tools rolled out. Here's the kinds of things that happened. Here's the sorts of situations that arose. Here are the challenges that society faced. And how can we look at that and maybe try to get ahead of the curve a little bit on what we think technology is going to be bringing us in the next few years?
Jason?
So one of the things I promised I would do in this event is that I would convey not just my own thoughts and ideas, but also some of that from within our History Communication Institute community. And that community comprises now about 150 people on 6 continents and includes historians and museum people, but also journalists and scholars of other disciplines and researchers and tech people. One of the concerns and one of the questions that has come up repeatedly in our conversations is the question around intellectual property. And I think that's something that AI engineers have a responsibility to take seriously. We've already seen this when it comes to authors and how their books and their works have been exploited by AI and large language models. We've now seen this with journalists. And we've seen companies that have brought AI developers to court. We've also seen agreements that have been reached to compensate media companies and journalists for their work. The same needs to happen with historians and scholars. If large language models and AI is going to develop applications based on the research and work that scholars have done for generations, that needs to be compensated. It can't just be exploited. And I think that's part of the ethics of these conversations. That's the way you build a partnership, is by recognizing someone's labor and their work and compensating them fairly for it. That builds trust, right? Right now, there's not a lot of trust between these worlds because it just seems like everybody working in AI wants to take information, exploit it for free, and turn it around for huge profits without rewarding those who did the work in the first place. So that would be part of it. And I think the other part of it would be that, and I've been saying this for years now. I don't think it's getting through, but I'll say it to these young folks who are on the call with us. It's really important to read history. Okay. Like you'd be amazed at how many responsible and ethical tech conversations I go to or participate in. And everyone feels like all of this started in 2016. Like there's a whole legacy of ethical and responsible tech conversations that extends way further back. I mean, just look at the questions around nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon proliferation. I mean, those are questions of ethical technology use. There's a whole literature from the 1940s onward that talks about the responsible use of that technology in the world. And I just continually find that people who work in AI and work in tech have never engaged with that history. It should be required, in my personal feeling, for anyone getting a major undergrad, uh, graduate, minor, taking classes in this area around ethical tech to engage with history, and particularly the history of technology and the responsible deployment of that technology. There should be courses on history inside responsible tech and just inside tech more broadly in STEM universities, departments such as the one that's hosting this conversation. There is a lot of really good, thoughtful analysis and ideas in that literature that is absolutely relevant to today. And it always surprises me how little of that people in STEM fields and tech fields have engaged with. So those would be my 2 points. You're on mute.
Sorry, Nathan, did you want to add something to that? I know unmuted, so in
I just
case.
want to offer an amen to everything Jason said. I agree with all that. I feel like as a technologist, I'm focused on talking about the technology, and I think there's so many ethical issues. I don't want to come off as a, evangelist for AI that doesn't acknowledge any of the issues with it, because there are so many real issues with the way that these models are trained and have been produced, and the way that these companies are currently making profit from these tools. And I 100% think there needs to be a reorientation around that as kind of a priority number one before we even talk about what happens next.
Yeah, I think from this whole conversation, it was a really, you know, mic drop moment, the moment you mentioned, Jason, that it's not just for historians to care about it, but people in tech must engage with history, um, because it's just more than just data. It's more about the memory, the lived experiences, especially when integrating into like day-to-day experiences of people. So as we move forward, it's not just like a challenge of building advanced AI, but ensuring it doesn't dilute or like perpetuate misunderstandings or inequity about our past. So thank you so much, both of you, for your great insights. We'll open it up to questions now because clearly this conversation doesn't end here, and it is up to us, technologists, especially in the 21st century, with students, historians, and the public, to critically engage in AI's role in history. And I will really compile this video recording well and kind of compress it, with how the museum did it with like particular questions separated as well. So I can share it with, students, especially students who couldn't make it today. But thank you so much for kind of challenging and helping us question whether AI's applications are truly reflective of the past. And we have a lot of great resources in the chat. Thank you so much, Jason, for compiling these before the panel, so we could have a great reading list for students. And yeah, we'd love to keep this conversation going. So any questions in the chat, or you can reach out to our panelists after the panel. But thank you both for your great insights, and I appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us here.
Okay, so there are a few questions. Ishita, how do you want to handle this? Do you want to read them out or how do you want
You
to?
can address any questions that you would like. Actually, I see one question that we could start with. Um, any book recommendations? That could be a quick one for responsible tech history.
Yeah,
I can
yes,
recommend. I
I
should
have.
recommend Jason's book.
I have one. I wrote one about this topic. It's called History Disrupted. I'll put the link in the chat. Here's the link for the actual publisher. Here's the link on Amazon. Um, I do have a chapter in the book about AI, but the whole book is related to this topic. Um, there's also, some stuff on Substack. I put a couple of links in the chat. There's this guy who does generative history. There's my Substack. There's a number of people who are writing about this. I think one value add that the HCI could do would be to put all of this together into a centralized resource so that people don't have to kind of scramble for it. Maybe we can build a web page for that. I will see if we can get some volunteers inside the HCI to do that.
I can
Um,
volunteer.
oh, that'd be great. Yeah. So it'd be great in the future to just have like a single page where we could point
Mhm.
people to a lot of different, because there have been a lot of people who've written about this, but it's largely in sort of blog format or like Twitter threads, and so it's very disparate. So pulling it together into one place would probably be useful.
Yeah. And if any of the students listening would love to, be part of HCI, you can get in touch with me and we can kind of start like a student group within HCI since Jason, I know you had some plans and you were looking to bring in more student perspectives in as well. Uh, and it's
Yeah,
a
just for
volunteering.
clarification purposes, the HCI, the History Communication Institute, was something I started already a couple years ago now. Nathan's been a key contributor. Ishita has been a key contributor. It's really a community. That's first and foremost what it is. It's a community of people who are interested in this intersection and care about it and want to help chart a better future. So that community has been involved in events like this one. We've released a couple of white papers. We have a Slack, which varies in terms of its activity, but there's been some good conversation and chat there. And then people have found also different types of collaborations. But it's really driven by volunteers. It's not a paid organization. It doesn't have its own like funding structure. So it's really just people who care about this topic and are passionate about it and want to help drive change. So if that sounds like you and you want to get involved, we'd love to have your help in taking it to the next level and doing different types of programs.
So we have some really nice comments in the chat as well in the Q&A. There's another question if any of you would like to pick on who should be responsible for data regulation. Neither the companies nor the government are willing to do so, especially in common regulation that's standardized across.
I'd say the people that aren't doing it are responsible for it. It's a problem.
Yes, I think this is a good segue to the next question. At what age do we start teaching kids AI, and what do we have to teach them? Because since the government and the tech companies are not responsible, it's on us to make sure how we perceive it.
Yes, so I actually know the person who's asked this question, so it's good to see you, my friend. He actually lives overseas, so it's great to have people from Europe joining in. Um, I think, Europe does education differently than the United States. So I'll just talk about from a United States perspective. And even before this current administration, education in the United States is highly, highly decentralized. I mean, I learned this when I was the director of the LePage Center years ago. So I used to be the director of something called the LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. We were located in Pennsylvania, and we wanted to do stuff with local schools in and around where we were in Pennsylvania. And I learned very quickly that literally one town to the next had completely different ways of doing things when it came to education. So if you wanted to get your materials integrated into the history curriculum, where we were in Pennsylvania, you literally had to go town to town to meet with people to try to make the case. Each town had its own people who worked on the curriculum. Each town had its own way of teaching the classes. Obviously, there were loose standards which sort of guided everything, but there's a lot of autonomy from school district to school district. So when it comes to AI, that creates a challenge because it's really difficult in the United States to roll something out at the national level and have everybody adopt it. It just doesn't work that way here, right? I mean, you literally have to go state by state, county by county, town by town to figure out how you're going to do AI literacy and AI education in these various places. And that's one of the things we're seeing now in the US is that this is happening very piecemeal. So some states like Illinois and New Jersey have some really interesting programs that they're rolling out, but other states, I won't name names, are really falling behind. And you have OpenAI also found this as well. They have very high adoption of AI in California, but very low adoption in places like Mississippi and Arkansas. So it creates that inequities that you talked about, Ishita. So, in terms of what age do we actually start teaching them? For me, I think the first instruction in AI should not be how to use it, but should be how to think about it. And I think that instruction can happen very early in elementary school. We can start teaching people, we can start teaching kids how to think about these applications even before we allow them to use it. In the same way that when you're taking your driver's test in the United States, you learn about operating a car before you actually get in it and start to drive it, right? You learn what it can do, what it cannot do, whether it's dangerous, why it's not good to disobey certain rules, why you shouldn't go so fast, why you must stop at red lights. You learn all that when you're younger, and then once you've learned that, you can get in the car and start driving. And I think we could apply the same principle to AI. We could teach kids from an early age to ask questions about it, to think critically about it, and then as they grasp that, they could then start playing with it.
Awesome. Wonderful, well-rounded discussion about, opportunities, challenges, next steps, key takeaways for students, book recommendations. Thank you so much all for your engagement and joining and still being here. Um, 2 minutes past. It really means a lot to all of us, and especially thank you to the panelists for your time. And we'll definitely be in touch soon.
Thanks, everyone. And if you want to stay in touch, please do connect with the History Communication Institute, or you can reach out to me via my Substack.
Thank you, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be here.